As Americans argue amongst themselves about continued aid for Ukraine, Russia is pressing ahead with its offensive. Now, while it's made some tactical gains in the Donbas region, that has come at the cost of many lives. And now, some Russian women have been protesting the deployment of their sons and husbands. But ahead of Russia's presidential elections next month, Vladimir Putin has been drumming up support for the war in Ukraine using an old Soviet slogan, "Everything for victory." But how far is Putin willing to go? Welcome to this week's edition of To the Point. A very warm welcome. I'm so glad to introduce our fantastic panel this week. We have Christoph von Marschall, a diplomatic correspondent for the German daily Tages-spiegel. Sarah Pagung, program director for international affairs at the Körber Foundation. And DW's former Moscow correspondent for almost 5 years, Emily Sherwin. A very warm welcome to you all. Thanks so much for taking the time. A lot to unpack here today. And I want to start with that speech that we heard from Putin in Tula, in which he's making references to this old Soviet slogan. He's saying, "Everything for the front, everything for victory." And Emily, I'm wondering for you, what does that tell you about the way that Putin is thinking about the next stages in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think, from the beginning in this war, there's been this reference that's being made, or this connection being made to the Second World War, which is a very emotional topic for Russians. In Russia, it's known as the Great Patriotic War. Almost every family will have some relative who was killed during that war, because over 20 million Soviet citizens were killed. So, a huge loss for the Russians. And that connection is very emotional. And it's one that Putin has been using since the beginning, kind of infusing this almost heroic narrative into the current war. And there's this narrative as well now that Russia is fighting against Ukrainians who the Russians have said are Nazis, but also against the entire West. So I think it's interesting that there's now this reinforcement of that narrative. And it's also interesting to see that Vladimir Putin is kind of hitching his election wagon to that narrative, to that very emotional narrative, and also to the war, because we've heard that, potentially the Kremlin was actually saying he should talk more about social issues, but he's very firmly connecting himself and his political future to this war.
Yeah, that is fascinating that he's really, as you say, hitching his wagon to this, even when it wasn't necessarily what advisors are saying. Christoph, as Emily says, this is a really emotional issue, harkening back to the Soviet Union's role in the defeat of the Nazis in World War II. And Putin, in that speech, was also calling for a social and economic mobilization of Russians. And I'm curious how you think practically he might be able to do that.
Well, he certainly has more young men who could serve as soldiers. He certainly has enough money to pursue this war. But to put it into perspective, I mean, it's surprising how difficult it is for Russia, who has so many more people, so much bigger economy than Ukraine, that they are where they are and not much further. After the beginning of the war, they moved forward very quickly. They encircled Kiev. Now they are back in the east and in the south. The Ukrainian offensive, they struggled as well. They couldn't gain much territory in the last year. But now Putin maybe sees an opening in this election year, which is an election year all over the world. For Putin, as we heard, he's connecting success in the war with his re-election bid. But we have also elections in the United States. And we see it that the West is struggling to give Ukraine the financial and the military aid they need to just keep the front as it is. And so we see, for Putin, election is something go all in. And for the West, is the question whether we can sustain our support for Ukraine, or is it politically too difficult? So really an existential question, or questions, we should say. Sarah, I'm curious about your thoughts on this rhetoric that we've had from Putin in that speech in Tula. Does it suggest to you that this is him looking also at a new phase in the war when you hear him say things like everything for the front, everything for victory?
So I think since maybe summer or autumn 2022, Putin's game or Russia's game was to basically wait out the West until support for Ukraine in the West crumbles due to elections, due to domestic questions about supporting Ukraine. And I think that he assumes that this point has finally come when we look at debates that we now have in Germany, but also in other European countries, and especially in the US. And I think for him, this year appears very decisive, as he really hopes that this support will finally crumble. And with all the social, economic, political mobilization that he stages within the country, you know, from schools to rallies, to companies, and to different cultural events, he really hopes that he can, you know, like finally win in Ukraine and really defeat the West.
That's an excellent point, and we are going to come back to that again later in the show. First, though, I think it would be helpful if we can take a look at the situation on the battlefield. I mean, Russia's incremental gains there have come at a really high human cost. And in a rare show of public dissent, we've even seen some Russian women protesting for the return of their loved ones from war.
They're determined to get their husbands back. These Russian wives are laying flowers on the grave of the unknown soldier. It's a protest, not a ritual. This is a war. People are being killed. Ordinary civilians. Men were drafted in the partial mobilization. We can't pretend that they're not dying over there. This kind of demonstration puts them at risk for harsh punishments, including imprisonment. Russia's prisons are increasingly filled with more dissenting activists who chose to take a stand against Putin's regime. These pictures paint a different portrait. Young Russians from the Young Army movement standing side by side with their president. Within a short period of time, nearly 5 million people have already joined the movement. This is a massive army. Russia will hold elections in March. But even though the result is a foregone conclusion, the question remains: how much support does Putin really have among the people?
That is the question, and I'd like to put it directly to you, Sarah. How much support does Putin have among the Russian population?
I think quite a lot, even though, and I think we have to admit that like we do have Poles in Russia, of course, but due to the repressions and the autocratic system, we have to handle them carefully. However, I would assess that we have roughly about maybe 20% who are strongly supporting the war, 20% who are really opposing it, and the big mass in the middle. And that's also, I think, something that reflects maybe, you know, how people actually support Putin. So how the system has been working over the last maybe 10 to 15 years is actually not by politically mobilizing people for Putin's cause or for any political cause, but rather about, you know, like depoliticizing them so that they're, you know, like not interested in politics, that they take a step back saying, you know, that's not for me. I'm not really interested, also because they're partly afraid of repression. So I think that is how, you know, the support for the regime and the support for the government is structured. However, if we again look at polls, even though we have to handle them carefully, Putin is still the most popular politician, which is also due to, you know, that he's all the time on TV doing nice things and helping people. And that, of course, you know, reflects in the attitude that people hold towards him.
Yeah, he has a great platform there, of course. You know, if depoliticization is the goal, Emily, I'm curious what you think when you look at something like this movement of wives protesting, wanting their husbands to come back from the front. I mean, what does this tell us? What are they risking by demonstrating like this? And how much influence do you think they actually have in society in Russia?
I think that depoliticization that Sarah was talking about is exactly why this movement is interesting, because these wives, sometimes mothers of the soldiers fighting at the front, they're the traditional support base for Vladimir Putin. You know, they're what would be considered his loyal core. And these are the people who are suddenly saying, actually, you know, we're not okay with this, and we're going to take to the streets. So that's one reason why it could be worrying, I think, for the Kremlin. And the other reason is that Russia has, you know, a long history of women's movements, protest movements during the war in Chechnya. There were also mothers' protests for political prisoners when I was covering events in Moscow. And it provides it's a real problem for the Kremlin in terms of optics, because what are they going to do? They're going to beat down these women on the street. That is something that is not a good look. So I think there have been some moves to silence these women. They've been talking about the police visiting them, about their rallies being banned, about their husbands on the front even getting visits from the FSB, having pressure put on them. But they're continuing, and in a way they're coming up against this repressive system that perhaps they hadn't known about before. So this could be something that radicalizes them and radicalizes others, but it's still, of course, a minority, and the Russian state is very experienced at repressing various protest movements.
Yeah. So if there's something of a thorn in Putin's side, Christoph, maybe we can look at the other end of that spectrum. We also saw there in that report the young army movement of these patriotic youth. How big are they? How influential are they? Are they really supportive of Putin?
Of course, we don't have an exact picture, but I would say that as mainly propaganda. It's overblown. I don't think that most young Russians think it's a patriotic thing to fight in Ukraine. I'm willing to die for Donbas. And therefore, let's look for the reference points. I mean, in these 2 years of war, whenever Putin tried to get more soldiers to the front, young people were doing the polling with their feet. They were trying to get out of the country. And as long as the sons of the middle classes in the big cities are concerned, it is a political risk for Putin, conscription. Therefore, he has his soldiers from prisons, from ethnic minorities, from provincial towns. So it has not this impact on the national picture. And that is the same with the mothers of soldiers. Another reference point, when we had the Afghanistan war after 78 and the 80s, at that time, the movement of the mothers of soldiers contributed that the Soviet Union had to end the war. We are not there yet because Putin controls the pictures of the protests and the demonstrations. So most of the Russians will not at all learn that there's a similar movement today.
But it is fascinating that there's that history there as well. Of course, all these political questions are really on the table right now because we are looking ahead to presidential elections in March. And Sarah, just for our international audience, I mean, when you think about elections in Russia, can you paint a picture for us to what degree these are actually free and fair elections and whether there's any kind of real opposition to Vladimir Putin?
They're not free and fair at all, and there is no room for real opposition in any presidential or also federal elections, which doesn't mean that these kind of elections doesn't serve a purpose inside Russia. But the purpose not to, change the government or maybe, that in the end, for example, the president gets less votes and maybe learns about, how he should alter his politics, for example. It's rather about, demonstrating the ability of the system to produce high voter turnout and a high support for Putin. So it's actually creating legitimacy for the whole system and for the person of Putin, which is very important for the stabilization of the whole system. So if we look at the elections, we quite certainly know how it's going to turn out in the end, so Putin will win. But will the regions, will the federal agencies, all the different parts of the state be able to produce these high voter turnouts plus a result that is at least as high as the votes that Putin gained in 2018? And I think these are the things that we should look to.
Yeah, this illusion, the way you put it, an illusion of legitimacy, I think, is really fascinating. Emily, for a while, there was an anti-war candidate running in these presidential elections, Boris Nadezhdin. We now know with just 5 weeks to go until the presidential elections, he is out too. He's off the ballot. Can you tell us exactly what happened there and what this says about Sarah's point?
So he's the second anti-war candidate that tried to qualify for these elections and is now also off the ballot. So I think it's interesting because we're seeing these mothers protesting. There are also surveys. Sarah pointed out that surveys during wartime are difficult, but we're seeing some surveys saying that basically the amount of people that would support a peace deal at the moment within Russia are now, that's a larger percentage than the people who want to keep fighting. So that's interesting, and that's something that the Kremlin definitely knows. They carry out their own surveys on Putin's popularity, on all kinds of issues behind the scenes that we never see. So it was interesting that the potential of an anti-war candidate in Boris Nadezhdin was even on the cards. There was seemed to be some dithering over whether he should qualify or not. Now, due to some procedural things to do with signatures that he collected, he's out. But I think there was some consideration within the Kremlin of whether they need that kind of pressure valve to release some of this anti-war sentiment. And I guess they decided it would be too much of a risk to have him on the ballot, because what if he actually did get a few percentage points unexpectedly?
Yeah, Christoph, is that your impression too, why he's not going to be on the ballot this year? Do you think that they found him to be too much of a threat to be running?
I think so. Again, I would say the war is not popular. At least it's not popular to go to war, and there's a certain percentage in the Russian population which is anti the war and not willing to sacrifice their children. And when that would come into the open, how big that percentage is, even if there's pressure and threats, if you go and vote for him, the risk was too big, I would agree. Yeah.
So this has been a really fascinating insight into Russian society as far as we can see from here in Berlin. I do want to take a look at the situation currently in Ukraine now on the battlefield. Kyiv, of course, saying that it is lacking ammunition and that the West hasn't delivered all of the aid that it has promised. And it is also at the same time hoping that new aid packages from the EU and potentially the United States could help bridge that gap. Let's take a look.
With a shortage of weapons, ammunition, and soldiers, President Zelensky is using slogans of perseverance to motivate troops on the front lines. You have such a difficult task and a clear mission: to beat back the enemy and win this war. To do so, Ukraine not only needs more weapons, but a lot more money to replenish its empty state coffers. After a lot of wrangling, Brussels has finally given the green light. We got 27 heads of state and governments to reach an agreement that will allow an additional 50 billion euros in aid for Ukraine. But the real question is, what can Ukraine expect from the USA? The Senate has introduced a package worth billions that combines aid to Ukraine with US border security. But House Republicans have already declared their opposition to it. If it passes, will it be enough to ensure Ukraine's survival?
So, Christoph, this is picking up on something you were touching on earlier. If it passes, will this aid be enough to ensure Ukraine's survival?
I'm afraid that this year can change the course of the war, because it's not enough support from the West. And now we have to make a distinction between financial aid and military aid. The European Union approved that 50 billion euro package. In the end, that is enough to keep the government running for the next month. But the more important aid comes from the United States, military aid. We see, since this is an election year in the United States, we shouldn't expect that Congress can make up the choice whether they want to support Ukraine. Military aid, the White House, in fact, de facto, the White House decided how much military aid they send to Ukraine, and that is much more than Europe can do. Europe is not even able to produce the 1 million artillery shoots which we need and promised to produce and deliver. And even the military aid package might come, not to a total end, but might be reduced strongly if Donald Trump wins the election at the end of the year. So if we have not enough financial support and we have the perspective that the military aid of the United States might be reduced come next year under a Trump presidency, then I think Ukraine will be in deep, deep trouble. And it is a real risk that might change the course of the war.
And Sarah, if we do see Trump elected in the United States, or even a further drift toward this nationalist America, Trump-style America first policy among Republicans in Congress, how existential do you think this is for Ukraine? What would the consequences be?
I think it's quite existential, not only because the military's aid and support of the U.S. for Ukraine is really crucial. So if we look at the numbers, now the European Union states are, supporting Ukraine military roughly a bit more than the U.S., but in total altogether. This just, gives you an idea of the size what the U.S. actually does. And what I fear is that in case the U.S. reduces its support for Ukraine, we will also have a kind of development in Europe, where different states start saying, okay, without the U.S., we cannot really endure this. It doesn't really make sense supporting Ukraine without the U.S. because we cannot supply enough. So maybe let's enter peace talk, or let's force Ukraine into a position where they have to, give into a position that is really unfavorable for them. So I think we really also have to, make sure that the European consensus to support Ukraine stays strong no matter what actually in the U.S. happens.
Christoph, do you agree where the U.S. goes, the EU follows in terms of support for Ukraine?
Yeah. That was the situation over the last 2 years. Chancellor Scholz always waited for a US decision whether to deliver battle tanks or whatever. It was always, he looked, what is President Biden doing? And then I'm trying to move the German behavior behind him. When it now comes to the next year and what Europe could do without this leadership of the United States, and that is also an important point. It's not just financial aid. It's not just military aid. Who holds this coalition, pro-Ukrainian coalition together? That's one guy. That's Joe Biden, because he has the authority of the United States as a superpower. Can we imagine here any person in Europe who could get in these shoes if Trump is elected? Chancellor Scholz? No. Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, nobody has this authority. And that would be also a huge loss. So my personal hope, but I'm not so sure whether Europe will do that, but my personal hope is that Europe finally says, this is a regional war in Europe. We should be able to win this war, or we should be able to enable Ukraine to win this war with our support. The European Union has economic resources 7 times bigger than Russia. So it's a question of organizing our resources and defining that we want Ukraine not to lose, we want to give them what they need not to lose, and we take pride in being able to do this without the United States. Not we are pushed into such a situation which we don't like and would like to avoid. We should take pride in finally having this moment where Europe steps up.
Well, given how far away we are from that currently, Emily, how do you think Putin is viewing all of this when he looks at this infighting within the United States and also even within the Republican Party there? Also, the inability of European leaders to do what Christoph is suggesting. Does this play in his favor?
Absolutely. All of this will be music to his ears, I think. I think initially, presumably, the Kremlin or Vladimir Putin was surprised at the strength of that coalition that Christoph was talking about. And, a lot of people have been saying he's just playing a waiting game at the moment, with this war of attrition, basically waiting for the money to run out when it comes to the West. And now we have this election year in the U.S. where Trump, is the potential Republican candidate. He's been talking about not supporting, or this America First policy anyway, and also not continuing support for Ukraine. And also the world has been looking much more to the Middle East with the conflict there. So I think that distraction is something that the Kremlin has been waiting for. And also, the money running out. And it's interesting because actually right now there's been a big discussion about Tucker Carlson, who you might have heard about. Who's this Fox presenter who's gone rogue and has his own show, super conservative. He's gone to Moscow to interview Vladimir Putin. So it does seem like even Vladimir Putin is trying to weigh into the debate going on in the U.S. and kind of back up that Republican narrative that Ukraine can't win anyway, that the financial support won't matter. So they're really using that to their favor, I think.
And Sarah, just your final thoughts here. Is what Emily says ringing true? Does it seem like Putin can outwait the West?
At the moment, that seems like a to me, like a legit strategy. Because if we look at the debate that we have in the US, but also the debates that we have within the EU and within Germany, support is crumbling. People are thinking about, okay, what should we invest to? Should we invest into security, and should we invest into Ukraine, or should we rather invest into, I don't know, digitalization or modernization of infrastructure, for example? Plus, we do see that we have a link between domestic and foreign policy, where a lot of political actors use the support for Ukraine as a leverage to, achieve different things domestically and internally. And I think that this is very, dangerous development that really endangers the support and the consensus for supporting Ukraine.
Well, I could talk to you all about this all day, but I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you to our fantastic panel, Christoph, Emily, and Sarah. I appreciate your insights today. And everybody watching at home, thank you for watching. Let us know what you thought in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, and please join us next time. Thanks so much.